going to talk for maybe just a half hour, maybe 40 minutes, and then we can discuss and have questions, discussions. Um, I'll be flipping back and forth with between screen share, so you have something to look at other than my charming face. Um, I would, I should just say, I'm a philosopher by trade. And we're all here engaged in interdisciplinary activity and with very different backgrounds and ways of looking at things. I'm a philosopher. Please be, when the time comes, whenever or in the middle of one of my sentences, please feel free to object and yell and criticize. I know you won't yell, but I just have to say, I guarantee you. I'm a philosopher. I guarantee you that nothing you could possibly say could be as upsetting as what my colleagues usually say to me. So um, let's go ahead. So this is a diagram of what for me are the orders of nature. The name for my general metaphysical view is ordinal naturalism. Really, it's simply a form of what philosophers would call a non-reductive naturalism, a particular kind. Um, that picture of the physical, material, biological, mental, and cultural, which represents certain orders or levels or zones of phenomena in nature, but also so happens to represent a chronological order of their evolution. And you see on the left-hand side, there's a dotted arrows indicating the advance of time and I would argue complexity. This is will not be unfamiliar. I mean, it's very similar to Greg's UTOC theory. It's similar to Tyler Volk. He has sort of a different grained analysis in terms of how many bits and pieces, how many stages. And it's familiar to other things from big history. So there's nothing actually that odd or strange here, at least in this context. Just a couple of things I will mention. One is you'll notice, and somebody, when I presented this at a philosophy conference, one of the remarks was, boy, well, you got everything in there, don't you? And that was meant as a criticism. And, my response was, well, no, I don't. And I have no way of knowing if I do. That's why the outside line is a dotted line. I mean, there's no way to know. We don't know everything. We shouldn't expect to. We are inside looking out and trying to understand the series of contexts that constitute nature as far as we can tell. And you'll never hear me utter the word everything, including that nature is everything, but that's a subsequent story. Um, so the I'm putting this up now, but then I'm going to take it down because the question is, how in the world do I get here? So it's what's the philosophical, for a philosopher, what's the sort of stages of argument that could or ought to lead to this point. Okay. So maybe I'll just leave it up for a little while so we have something to look at. But I'm going to stop talking about that now. So from my point of view, philosophy, which can be defined in many ways, is best defined as at least the most general form of inquiry. So philosophy engages in inquiry. To say that is to say that philosophy is continuous, not identical to, but continuous with the natural sciences, but also the social sciences and the cultural sciences, and all the way up to, art history. When we're inquiring into aspects of the world, philosophy typically is involved with looking at all other disciplines if it wants to. Now, there's some things that philosophy approaches that are, it's not quite right to say unique to it, but let's say that it has a definite business interest in examining these. Some other inquiries do touch on them, but they don't make it their main business. On the one hand, epistemology, or the whole study of the nature of knowledge and trying to justify knowledge and the limits of knowledge. On the other hand, there's a whole bunch of aspects of reality which certain, or which we might take to be aspects of reality, which it's not the business of, let's say, the natural or social sciences explicitly to discuss. People from those backgrounds do discuss these issues, but they kind of do it off the clock in terms of their standard methods. What I mean is things like values and norms. I mean, everybody who does social science or natural science has some views about human ethics, politics, etc., but they don't, and even if they write an essay on ethics or politics, what they don't try to show is that their physics or theory of biology justifies a particular politics or ethics. But philosophers are interested in aesthetics and politics and ethics, as just like the theory of truth, have to figure that stuff out. There's also some what might be kind of arcane things. We're interested also in things like universals as opposed to particulars. In other words, we can agree there's lots of particular trees, but does tree exist or what status does it have? And that might seem interesting, but it gets more complicated or interesting if you try to ask, does the number two exist? Is it real? What status does it have? Likewise, questions of time, modality, necessity, the past, the future, all this stuff. Now, we're not going to talk about these anymore. All I'm saying is, as a philosopher, when I go to try to figure out naturalism, in the back of my head is I've got to address these things, or I've got to formulate a general view which isn't incapable of addressing them. Okay, so a slight amount of personal history. So I started out, the main topic of my career has really been theories of modernity, trying to understand the modern age. Hence, a lot of social theory, politics, and all sorts of stuff. I wrote an early book called The Dilemma of Modernity, then a book called The Ends of Philosophy, which was really my attempt to deal with it's called The Ends of Philosophy, colon, foundationalism, pragmatism, and postmodernism. So trying to deal with that. That was that was followed by a big anthology on modernism and postmodernism. Then there's a book on politics, civil society, because part of this is, arguing about the Nate, whatever you think about what the ideal form of human government is or form of political society, from my point of view, that's entirely presumes a certain kind of social history. That is, certain kinds of political organization can't be had in certain kinds of societies. So, in other words, the theory of modernity has a lot to say about that. Then finally, there was a book on culture called Cultural Revolutions, and it partly had to do with cultural relativism. Okay, that's enough. Now, one more thing. This is still by way of kind of introduction. As you may know, or may know parts of it, philosophy in the second half of the 20th century, and although I am old, that is indeed my lifetime. It doesn't go, my lifetime isn't before the Second World War. In the second half of the 20th century, Western philosophy, with all its fascinating and interesting changes, besides separating into things like analytic philosophy, continental philosophy, and then other schools like pragmatism, etc. The other thing it did was philosophy in the second half of the 20th century mostly rejected the approach of foundationalism. By that, what I mean is any attempt to say that our knowledge of ourselves and the world has to be grounded in some kind of self-evident claims. Everybody throws this out. Analytic philosophers, starting with Quine, throw it out. Certainly, continental philosophers throw it out. Postmodernists go much further than that, but they are certainly part of this. Um, Pragmatists also. So Richard Rorty is a famous name associated with this anti-foundationalist movement. When foundationalism was thrown out between the, let's say, 1960 and 1980 or so, differently by each of these different philosophical movements, for many people, that meant systematic metaphysics is out. Because without foundations, how can you possibly do it? For a while, some of you, as you're familiar with, for a while, metaphysics got thrown out. But metaphysics came back. There's a lot of metaphysics being done in contemporary philosophers, but it's highly specialized. So, in other words, will be writing a book on David Lewis was a huge figure in this, and his view is based in modal logic. So you have to figure out the nature of possibility and possible worlds and all this stuff. So there's tons of young philosophers doing metaphysics, but not systematic metaphysics. So the attempt to, in a coordinated way, deal with a whole bunch of different parts of what we think of as reality and how they can go together. Okay. And let's say that's, in late middle age, I kind of set out in that direction. Okay. And so the question is, moving in that direction, how did I end up with, I don't mean historically in terms of my lifetime, but what leads me to the orders of nature there. So uh, if you want the simple answer, um, not to be too reductive about myself, essentially, my picture of the world is really a combination or the development of two things. On the one hand, a philosophical approach, which is not well known at all, called objective relativism, which was part of the Columbia Naturalist School. So in the middle of the 20th century, John Dewey was the most famous American pragmatist philosopher. He was at Columbia, though he retired, but then he lived so long that he lived all through the middle of the 20th century. Columbia, where he had been and in a sense still was, Columbia put together this school, Columbia Naturalism, which was a non-reductive naturalist school. Okay. Now, in it, there were several people like Morris Cohen, who was related to it, John Herman Randall, Ernest Nagel, who was the first important philosopher of science in the United States, who was, in effect, at least half-time a positivist, and the other half a pragmatist. Anyway, and then finally, a guy named Justus Buchler. Now, it so happens, I won't go into the details are long, but Buchler wound up producing the most coherent theory of what the others called objective relativism. And we can talk about that in general if you have questions, but the easiest and straightforward way is just go straight to Buchler. So now Buchler, oh, I'm sorry. I'll just mention in passing this really fine cartoon that I forgot to mention. It's from Sidney Harris. Um, and if you can read it, it's an older and younger astrophysicist walking away from their big telescopic dish, and the guy's saying, "I'll be working on the largest and smallest objects in the universe, superclusters and neutrinos. I'd like you to handle everything in between," to the younger person. And the spirit of what I do is encapsulated in that cartoon. That I'll put it in this way. The stuff in the middle cannot be understood as determined by either the most fundamental layer of natural existence or the most comprehensive layer, because the stuff in the middle is where the complexity lies. Okay, now let's go to Buchler. So this is going to seem very odd, and by all means, it ought to seem odd. Buchler formulated this metaphysics of natural complexes, and essentially the first claim is this. This is Buchler talking. Anything discriminable in any way, that is, through experience, through thought, through language, anyway, is what he called a natural complex. And every natural complex functions in orders of relatedness to other natural complexes. The term natural complex could be applied then to anything in the broadest sense of the term thing that you can think of or mention. It applies to entities, processes, structures, thought, actualities, etc. That paragraph that I just read is a natural complex. The ideas in it are natural complexes. And the computer screen or the book in which it appears, those are natural complexes too. It's a general term. Two natural complexes, because of the word complex, from Buchler's point of view, no natural complex is simple. And simple means incapable of further analysis. Okay? Now, and we can talk about this later, people will say, well, what about quarks or, leptons and etc. We can talk about those. But I would put it this way. Buchler didn't say this, but I would say it for him. To think of something truly as a simple, it would have to be the case that it would remain the same even if everything else were different. And I would say we don't know what that would be. We have no idea of what such a thing would be. Third, very important for Buchler, he accepts the principle of the ontological parity of all complexes. And what that means is nothing is more real or existent than anything else. He means that literally. The unicorn is as real as the horse. Uh, yes, Rob, you want to interrupt?
Yeah, sorry, I took your thing about asking questions seriously. So when I was
You
thinking
should
about
never,
Buckler's,
please, never take me seriously. Go
yeah,
ahead.
when I was thinking about Buckler's point of view on this simples, one of the things that I was thinking about is, and this is sort of my question for you is, do you think so in the traditions of the whole, capital W? You
Yeah,
have some ultimate truth claims, put aside
yeah,
whether, philosophically they're grounded or not. I'm just trying to
right,
understand the Buckler. You
right,
have the understanding of sort of an ultimacy of monism that is a ground of being that could be
right,
considered as non-dual ground. And I was trying
right,
to understand whether Buckler would
right.
reject it on exactly that point.
Completely.
Yeah.
That's right. Now,
Okay.
Buckler, the Columbia Naturalists all did, right? Now, partly because they didn't have a religious bone in their bodies all taken together. Um, the different schools of American philosophy, like Columbia and Yale, had really different temperaments. The religious people went to Yale
Yeah.
philosophy, like Paul
We have one of
Weiss.
them on the call today.
Oh yeah. So the Paul Weiss, who was the founder of the Metaphysical Society. Um, Now, here's what I would do. Buckler would say the whole is out. We don't know what the whole means. Now, he did write an essay where he tried to moderate that. When we get to my description of the way I take Buchler and objective relativism, the way I reformulate it, I would say, um, no, it's just that it's that about which our claims must be the most tentative of any other claims we make. In
Yep.
other words, that to talk about the whole,
Yeah.
or to talk about simples, but the whole is a bigger case. Um, I think there's nothing ridiculous or linguistically uh, inappropriate of talking about the whole. What I would say, though, is this, and this is in the spirit of Buchler. What we can't do, I think, is allow a claim about the whole to overrule our robust claims about
Yep.
what we encounter in experience and in the sciences. That you can't do. So
And
anyway,
you,
that's
yeah, that's fantastic. I know you'll get to I know you'll get to localism, local ontologies.
right.
At some point, I'm curious how the local ontologies and Buckler's simplicity marry up. But yeah, this is
Yeah, yeah.
great. Thank you.
Okay. Well, anyway, so ontological parity, the next one, thank you for that. Ontological parity is the next one. It just means literally. So, in other words, um, are there unicorns? Well, Buckley would say, of course there are unicorns, but they obtain in the order of literary history. There are horses in literary history, but there are also horses that you can ride. And in the realm of biology. And Buchler, this is very important for Buchler because he thinks, for example, you could never talk about the history of art and literature if you couldn't, say there are true and false claims that you can make about Sherlock Holmes. People write books about Sherlock Holmes, obviously. People spend their lives thinking about Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes, in other words, now, in some ways, I don't want to do inside baseball here. Inside the objective relativism, I claim the person who invented it, who started it, was this guy, Morris Cohen, in the 20s and 30s. But anyway, the way Cohen would put it is simply the question for metaphysics is not what is real. The question is, how is anything real? In what manner is it real? In what order of relations does it function? That's the metaphysical question, not what is or is not. Okay. Lastly, you can tell that one of the things most weird about Buckler's metaphysics, the whole approach is it's distributive rather than collective. That is, I'll give you, I'll try to be clear. Here's what Buckler doesn't do. There's an excellent book by a terrific philosopher knows a lot of stuff, mainstream and not mainstream. His name was John Post, and he might have been at Villanova, or he might have been at Emory. I'm not sure which. Maybe Villanova. Anyway, um, and Post wrote a book, and he said near the beginning, he said, "Look, after all, what is metaphysics trying to do?" This is Post talking now, not Buchler and not me. And Post said, basically, what a metaphysics tries to do is it takes anything you can mention, the total of what there is or what we can refer to, and tries to find that subset of all those things which are most real and determine everything else. That project is precisely not what Buchler is doing. He doesn't think there's any such thing. Nothing's more real than anything else. His task of his metaphysics is to be able to look at anything as a natural complex with its own traits or properties and inside an order of relations. And you take that picture and reapply it and reapply it. Greg?
Yeah, so I think this is clear about the how it's real, but I guess I would want to so I used to believe Santa Claus was real, and then I discovered he wasn't real,
Right.
right? Like, how do we make sense out of that claim? Is
Hmm.
it simply the case that actually what I'm doing is how I thought Santa Claus was real needs to be shifted? Is that
Right.
then that
So
makes sense to
from
me?
Buckler's
Yeah, go
from
ahead. That's
Buckler's
what.
right. In Buckler's way of talking, Santa Claus is as real as anything else.
But there's meaning to the statement that I used to believe he was real and then he's not, right?
You used to believe that Santa Claus physically came down the chimney and physically put presents under the tree.
Right.
You've discovered that's not true.
Okay.
And what Buckler would say is, what you mean is you've discovered that he's merely a literary figure.
Okay. Right. That's how he's real. Right. I've
Correct.
shifted how he's real. That how he's real
Correct.
makes it a lot clearer to me in terms of how to
Correct.
justify this. Yeah.
I'll give one more example of what Buckler would say, which by the way is not quite what I would say. But this is what Buckler, this is objective relativism. Um, are the train tracks convergent or parallel? Right? So um, you ride on the train tracks, they're parallel. You stand on the train tracks, and if you're a creature with binocular vision, you look down the tracks and they appear to converge in a point in the distance. Buckler's objective relativism, and this all comes, by the way, from neutral monism and a bunch of characters early in the 20th century. It's a pluralistic form of that. And what Buckler has to say is they are both parallel and convergent. They're parallel in one context and convergent in another. That's Buckler. Okay? Okay. Now I'm going to stop with Buckler. Now, I learned Buckler's view a long time ago. Buckler claimed to be a naturalist, like all the other folks in the Columbia naturalist tradition. Buckler was, when he would be asked later in life, are you a naturalist? He said, yeah, but I'm not one of those scientific naturalists. Indeed, he is not, because what I just said is not compatible with scientific naturalism. Okay? What happened to me was I ran into the work, I'll get to him in a moment, but into all the various um, Philip Anderson, Herbert Simon, Donald Campbell, Roger Sperry, Stuart Kauffman, Prigogine, Stanley Southey, Lorenz, and finally William Wimsatt, above all. All these characters who were scientists who accepted the notion of either emergence or you could call it hierarchical systems theory, right? Theories of complexity and systems theory, hierarchical systems theory that evolved, even though the idea of emergence goes back to the British emergentists, a little older than that, the beginning of the 20th century. It popped up back in the late 20th century because of a whole bunch of scientists actually who were saying we can't be complete reductionists. Okay. Now I'm going to now say something about Wimsatt um, and reduction, and then we'll get back to how this alters the objective relativism as Buckler, because what I am is essentially putting hierarchical systems theory most explicitly in Wimsatt into a language that comes from Buckler. And I got to alter his language a little bit to make that happen. Okay. Um, let's move to, here we go. Now, um, let me just, this is a lot to read. I'm only going to refer to little bits and pieces of this. So, uh, Wimsatt, who for a long time he was a philosopher at the University of Chicago. He was really a philosopher of biology, but who studied a lot of other things, like even engineering, and that actually has some relevance here. So I'm just gonna, I know some people are, they're worried about the term emergence. I'm not wedded to the terms, but I am wedded to some of the aspects of the world that it seems to properly describe. Anyway, the big thing about Wimsatt's notion of reduction, and it can all be found in his book, Re-engineering Philosophy for Limited Beings, Piecewise Approximations to Reality, a mouthful. Those are just a bunch of essays that he wrote over the years, but that's all his important essays, except for one, are in that book. All right. What's the big thing about reduction? He actually calls himself a reductionist. But what that means is it's inevitable for the natural sciences to look for reductions whenever it can find them. His claim is you find partial reductions of lots of phenomena and complete reductions of very, very few. And what's left over is emergence. So, from his point of view, I'm a natural system. There are certain things about me, properties I have, that you can explain by reducing me to my components as described by physics, but very few. Like mass is one of them. Okay. And that's why he says there's a law of the conservation of mass. There's other things that you can describe correctly by reducing me to certain chemical or then biological components. Others, you can't do that for either. In other words, complex systems are only partly reducible. And that means that emergence and reduction are compatible because you're giving some explanations of a phenomenon by referring to its components and their interaction rules. And then others, you have to refer to comparably scaled systems. And yet others, you have to refer to some kind of constraints or impositions that the whole is effecting on the parts. And that's not reductive anymore. That's emergent. Anyway, so I just want to, I can read a couple of quotes here and let me just point out some of these just because I think compared to everybody else I've read, Wimsatt has the most usable, valuable, and yet open notion of emergence. So number one, he just says, what does reduction do? The reason we engage in reductions is they explain system properties as mechanically resulting from aggregates of components. Aggregates of components always, by the way, even to decide what the components of a system are, you have to make a perspectival decomposition of the system and then regard the components as ideally interacting under context-independent rules. In other words, if a system is just composed of hydrogen atoms, there will be an interaction rule that says how two, three, or four hydrogen atoms interact with each other. Okay. Emergence, he defines as non-aggregativity. That is a system property, not reductively explicable. Okay. I'll just mention he has four different conditions of reductive aggregativity. In other words, you can say that a system is nothing but its components only if these four are satisfied. Intersubstitutability or invariance of a system property under rearrangements, qualitative similarity under scaling. That is, you make the thing a little bigger or a little smaller. Does that qualitatively change the properties of the whole? Reaggregativity or invariance of system properties under decomposition. Can you take it apart, put it back together, and it still works? And linearity, where the change in output is proportional to change in input. Okay, I think I'm going on too long with this. I'll just mention briefly, he has a very useful notion of levels. Okay, so my orders, five orders, are sort of macro levels. Levels for Wimsatt are families of entities usually of comparable size and dynamic properties, which characteristically interact primarily with each other, and which taken together gives us an apparent rough closure over a range of phenomena. In other words, our division of things into levels is not an arbitrary decision on the part of the inquirer. It's something we find in nature, that things tend to, at the level of the system description, they tend to interact with comparably scaled systems, even though these are then dependent on and composed by lower level, lower scaled components. Okay, I think I'm going on a little too long here. My point is, I'll just say this about combining Buchler and Wimsatt. So, Buchler's notion of anything whatsoever as a natural complex, it's possible to take that and then use Wimsatt's notion of emergence and levels to define naturalism. Okay? There we go. Ordinal naturalism. So this is my view. Naturalism is the hypothesis that whatever's discriminable functions in one temporally enduring ensemble of complexes called nature, where no set of members is causally isolated from all others. Now, the point is, all that definition does is rule out certain things, like the transcendent, a transcendent that is utterly disconnected from nature, or it also rules out something like mind material Cartesian dualism, where mind and matter are utterly causally isolated from each other. That is, where they can't causally interact. Okay. Two, so number one is not an adequate, doesn't do much for us. It just shows what has to be excluded from naturalism. Number two is, in our nature, some kinds of natural complexes asymmetrically depend on others, exhibiting irreducible emergent properties, which may exert downward causation on the kinds of complexes on which they depend. And then these can be understood as systems, which are constituted by structures, processes, and subaltern systems of varying degrees of entification, which I then locate in at least five hierarchically arranged orders of increasing complexity: the physical, material, biological, mental, and cultural, which correspond to different sciences and the historical evolution of nature. One point I would just make here is that, from my point of view, one of the part of the impact of Buchler on uh, this emergent naturalist view is that there's no reason to give priority, ontological priority, to anything, including systems or processes or structures. So, for example, very traditionally in philosophy, and everyone knows this, there was the metaphysics going all the way back to Aristotle. Aristotle endorsed the substance metaphysics that was dominant, really, in various ways, almost virtually to the 19th century. There were different decisions about what are the substances, but nevertheless, a substance metaphysics. People like Whitehead and others said, no, we need to process metaphysics. What's primary is process, not entities. There are some people in the philosophy of physics called structural realists who today want to say, no, structure, that is certain organizational relationships, which can be described mathematically, those are the ultimate realities. From my point of view, there's no reason to decide any of these as prior. Okay. So processes, in fact, most systems that we meet in the world, not all, but most, are simultaneously entities, that is a kind of system, which has components that are undergoing a process in which they maintain a certain kind of structure. And if you drop process or components or structure, you wouldn't have the system anymore. So they're all there. I kind of think I've been droning on too long. What I'm going to do is just say one last thing since I brought it up. So you remember my point about the train tracks in Buchler. So Buchler's naturalism, non-reductive naturalism, was so pluralistic that Buchler would say um, the train tracks are both parallel in one order of relations, like they're parallel in relation to the ground that they're sitting on. They're parallel in relation to the train that moves on them, but they're convergent in relation to the binocular vision of the human being standing on them, right? So the convergence is a real aspect of the train tracks. The parallelism is a real, but they're in separate. And from Buckler's point of view, as long as you always keep the context separate, you never run into a contradiction. It's just like saying the coin is from some perspectives a circle and other times an ellipse, and it's got all these properties in different situations. Now, what I would say is that's that kind of pluralism and contextualism is inadequate for any view which takes modern natural science seriously. In fact, that takes just everyday engineering seriously. So, what are we left with? Well, it's not that hard once you accept emergence or hierarchical systems. Namely, from my point of view, it is true that the convergence of the train tracks is a real phenomenon of the train tracks. It's true that the parallelism, but the is a real aspect of the tracks, but the parallelism is prior. It's not more real, but it comes first because the trains are a material object, and as a material object, they're structured in this stable way. The, the convergence is dependent, the convergence of the tracks is a perspectival representation of the tracks, which is caused by them, but can only occur if you've got a living organism with visual perception. So it's an emergent property in the biological order that comes out of the material order. Each are real, just as our dreams at night are real. Okay? So reality applies equally to all these things. Nevertheless, in a world in which there's asymmetrically dependent systems, everything mental depends on something biological, which depends on something material. So there is a primacy to the material analysis over the psychoanalysis, but it doesn't mean it's more true. So just as I would put it this way, and then I'll stop. Do the natural sciences have a priority over the social and, the Geisteswissenschaften, the sciences of humanity and mind and cultural? Do they? They do have one, but it's not epistemic. It's not that their knowledge is of greater certainty or anything. It's simply that physics applies to more of the universe. And the things we call biological and, mental depend on the things described by the physical and material sciences. It's in that sense that they have a priority, but neither is more real than the other.